Part 2 Derrida reading Freud The Paradoxes of Archivization. Freud advanced only by suspending, without any possibility of stopping, all the theses at which his successors or as his readers in general would have liked to see him stop. One while, no doubt, countless other pathways may be broken through the thickets of Derrida's encounter with Freud. My reading here is organized around the theses that Derrida risks in Archive Fever, but it will, in turn, draw from the material of other essays where relevant. For Derrida, the theme of archivization is intimate to psychoanalysis because it ties itself directly to the acts, processes, and places of memory both as individual psyche and as documentation. Addressing the Freudian legacy in these terms, he risks 3+1 theses, or prostheses, on the subject of Freud's theses toward the end of Archive Fever. 3 of these theses, he remarks, have to do with the concept of the archive, but, as he aims to show, what is the concept of the archive, is the wrong question here. To approach the theme more obliquely, he begins not at the archive itself but with the name arc that it shelters. This word, he notes, brings together two principles, one of commencement, but also a nomological principle of commandment. 3 One may wish, as a start, to order Derrida's theses along the lines of these two principles. The first two theses, which address psychoanalysis in its theoretical exposition, refer to, as Derrida puts it, the arc in the physical, historical or ontological sense, which is to say to the originary, the 113 first, the principle, the primitive, in short to the commencement. 5 The first addresses psychoanalysis as a sustained and sophisticated study of memory, NEM, and faces precisely the question of its origin in the psychical apparatus. The second addresses psychoanalysis as a theory of the archival process and concerns itself with the role of the death drive and related notions, such as repetition, in the processes of transcendental constitution, and, grafted onto this, those of deconstitution in analysis, anamnesis. The third thesis is directed toward archivization as documentation, hypomnem. It therefore has more directly to do with psychoanalysis as an institution and gathers together related questions that concern the archivization of psychoanalysis itself, of its life if you will, of its acts, of its private and public procedures. 6 Unlike the first two theses, then, at least apparently, this thesis refers to the arc in the nomological sense, to the arc of the commandment. 7 But there is one other, deconstructive, thesis, having to do with the concept of concept 8 which disrupts the neat order of division just articulated. According to this thesis, the word arc, sheltered in and remembered by the word archive, is already fractured by a multiple fission that makes it impossible to gather up a unified concept of the origin. For example, Derrida notes, even before the word marks the split between the physical, historical, or ontological principle of an occasioning event and the nomological principle of its constitutive and protective recording, the very notion of the arc as an occasioning event is already split between nature and history, that is, between physis as gift, implying the chance of surprise or unexpected events, and thesis, tech, nomos, etc. in the form of the constituting recognition that is caught up in the ecstasies of time, of past and future, memory and anticipation, and, therefore, the authority of history, convention, prior knowledge, and tradition. The principle of commencement is already contaminated by what is at work in the principle of commandment. This difficulty at the origin, announced in the word arc, accordingly, is the ruin of any attempt to conceptualize the archive, which is traditionally supposed to come after the originally present event as its record. Archival violence is, therefore, in Derrida's words, the first figure of an archive, because every archive is at once institutive and conservative, revolutionary and traditional. An economic archive in this double sense, it keeps, it puts in reserve, it saves, but in an unnatural fashion, that is to say in making the law, nomos, or in making people respect the law. A moment ago we called it nomological. It has the force of a law which is the 114 law of the house, oikos, of the house as place, domicile, family, lineage, or institution. 9 In other words, what one may call for short the archontic principle, the principle of commandment, is the condition of the possibility of the archive. But, because it is unnatural, that is, an imposition of law or artifice upon physis, event, this very condition, while necessary, simultaneously makes the archive strictly impossible. This aporetic vacillation means that, as Derrida notes, nothing is less reliable, nothing is less clear today than the word archive. Again, nothing is thus more troubled and more troubling today than the concept archived in the word archive. 10 Further, Derrida implicates Freud at the core of this trouble. He argues, on the one hand, that an economic archive fever is the direct consequence of much that Freud wrote. If nothing is less clear than the word and the concept archive, then, in Derrida's words, what is more probable, on the other hand, and more clear, is that psychoanalysis is not without responsibility in this trouble. Again, in naming psychoanalysis here, one refers already, in any case, to the archive which is classified, at least provisionally, under the name of psychoanalysis of Freud and of a few others. In other words, if we no longer know very well what we are saying when we say archive, Freud is undoubtedly not without responsibility. But the name of Freud, the name of the Freuds itself becomes plural, thus problematic. 11 In many ways, what Freud writes implicitly or explicitly challenges what Derrida calls the logocentric closure of traditional Western metaphysics, for the syntax and labor of Freudian discourse slips apart from and is not reducible to the concepts, all of which, despite themselves, retain residual metaphysical commitments. Or, put in another way, Derrida also argues that Freud's insights, his intuitions, exceed both his concepts and his discourse, or, that is, certain performatives in the construction of his texts. 12 In short, part of the Freudian legacy, according to Derrida, is to have undermined the very possibility of forming coherent concepts and thus to have ensured that every word and every concept, beginning with the word arc and including all those that make up the corpus of psychoanalysis as a science, are inherently divided against themselves. Concerning the archive, Derrida notes, Freud never managed to form anything that deserves to be called a concept. Neither have we. By the way, 13 To the word concept, which would be too rigorous, he opposes the word notion, by which he aims to indicate the open imprecision or relative indetermination of a series of impressions insistently associated with a word through the unstable feeling of a shifting figure, or of an infinite or indefinite process. He insists that this imprecision does not indicate a theoretical feebleness destined to be rectified by further clarification. On the contrary, he argues, I consider it to be the possibility and the very future of the concept, to be the very concept of the future. In other words, there are essential reasons for which a concept in the process of being formed always remains inadequate relative to what it ought to be, divided, disjointed between two forces. Yet, on the other hand, Freud also betrays the radically uneconomic tendencies in much of his writing. In the construction of his theoretical texts, in his conceptualization of psychoanalytic practice, or in his concern for his own legacy, he repeats certain metaphysical gestures that he has already subverted. His insights, then, are also threatened by the fact that his discourse does not shake entirely free of certain metaphysical residues. There are, therefore, incessant and unresolved conflicts and slippages in Freud's texts. In Derrida's words, the principle of the internal division of the Freudian gesture, and thus of the Freudian concept of the archive, is that at the moment when psychoanalysis formalizes the conditions of archive fever and of the archive itself, it repeats the very thing it resists. 14 Accordingly, he argues, Freud's discourse on the archive, and here is the thesis of the theses, seems thus to be divided. As does his concept of the archive. It takes two contradictory forms. That is why we say archive fever. 15 In sum, his fourth, deconstructive thesis of these theses disorganizes the first three, spreading them across economic and economic tensions according to the circular logic of paradox. 16 In his words, one should be able to find traces of this contradiction in all Freud's works. 17 Derrida's three theses on Freud are bound together by a common thread, namely the divisive spectre of death at the heart of life. The first concerns the paradoxically decentering centrality of death, hypomnema, at the core of the so-called living psyche. Derrida argues that Freud outlines a theory of the psyche in which the traditional figures of death, repetition, writing, are found to be crucially intrinsic to psychical life, making it irreducible to living memory, or anamnesis, the act of recollection, rememoration. One assumes novelly that the archive begins with the force of impression, that the beginning or commencement is a past-present, at once institutive and conservative pressures imprint on substrates, making for 116 the first time recognizable marks, traces inscribed in the psyche, circumcisions traced on the skin, footprints left in ash, leaving lasting impressions, records, which condition the archivization to come and to which one may dream of returning, via the archive, here reduced to a mere hypomnesic supplement, at which point the archive becomes redundant. But it merely raises a difficulty to note that the archive begins with the force of impression. At what point precisely does the pressure of the impressing force become an imprint left behind? What if the space that supposedly clearly separates the original from the archival trace that indicates it turns out to be an impossible cora? What if the difference that must be in order to make an impression or copy possible also, without remedy, makes it impossible? What if the print, the trace, copy, citation, or interpretative recognition, is the first figure of the archive? 18 And what if Freud both recognized and refused this? For, in the end, Derrida argues, despite all the difficulties associated with establishing where the so-called living psyche ends and the supposedly dead archive begins, Freud does ultimately resort to this distinction. In Chapter 4, I amplify this thesis by reading it together with an earlier text, Freud and the Scene of Writing, where Derrida considers three of Freud's metaphorical models of the psyche, demonstrating that each successive model shifts closer to the thinking of difference, yet metaphysical residues still remain. Derrida's second thesis, addressed in Chapter 5, has to do with the reinterpretation of Freud's concepts in terms of the death drive as the non-originary motivating force behind psychical, synthetic, processing. Derrida argues that the quasi-conceptuality of the death drive, which coordinates the divergent thematics of conservation, return, aggression, destruction, and dissolution, entangles the psychoanalytic theory of constitution in the double bind of economic and aneconomic aparias, so opening it to the multiple risks, but also the chances, of fiction, fabrication, prosthesis, and delusion, which are brought together, in archive fever, in the quasi-figure of the spectre. Yet simultaneously, Freud resists his own radical insights, since the Enlightenment figure in him does not, apparently, always want to speak with phantoms. 19 He does not always believe in the fundamentality of fabrication but sometimes resorts in the final analysis to the originary effectivity of a base of immediate perception. 20 Paradoxically, he does not always believe in belief but sometimes believes in knowledge, truth, and reality. I have grafted onto this thesis the related dilemma concerning the deconstitution or analysis of the psyche imposed by the isomorphism of analysis and the death drive, or repetition compulsion. The second part of Chapter 5 addresses similar aporetic entanglements associated with Freud's conception of the task of psychoanalysis. Chapter 6 addresses Derrida's third thesis, which concerns the double bind of return and destruction, killing and repeating the name of the father, which disorganizes all of the notions that are essential to establish a living tradition, institution, interpretation, invention, convention. According to Derrida, Freud's genius, here, is to have uncovered the stifling economic structure of what I shall call for short the archontic circle. Freud shows that the rebellion of a group against a strongly authoritarian tyrant leaves the group in a power vacuum where, due to a powerful residual need for authority, ambivalent forces of pride, guilt, and fear predominate. This intolerable ambivalence, if left unresolved, leads the group to impose upon themselves the very restrictions they have just thrown off. The prohibitions once imposed on them by the tyrant are now internalized and self-imposed. Moreover, he tacitly uncovers a way out of it via the uneconomic feminine Oedipus complex. But Freud of all people, after all he has demonstrated concerning the circular trap of authority, remains within the archontic circle, not only in his insistent patriarchy but also in his attempts to institutionalize psychoanalysis. This in turn opens up the question of the status of any reader or interpreter of Freud. Here, then, apart from demonstrating that Derrida reads the tension in Freud in terms of an economic moment and an economic recapitulation that resists it, I also hope to give the necessary background reading to come to grips with Lacan's revision. One should bear in mind that Derrida clearly does not highlight these traces of contradiction, in the weak sense, for the sake of forming better psychoanalytic concepts or to demonstrate how to escape the uneconomic and economic demands placed upon readers of Freud. The point is to show that psychoanalysis, if perhaps without Freud's explicit blessing, demonstrates that concept formation as such, while always necessary, is nevertheless aporetic, violent, paradoxical, contradictory, in a word, impossible. And this applies to Freud's own concepts too. When pressed to their logical conclusions, they too reveal their aparias in the form of paradoxical or contradictory theoretical requirements or in the form of performative contradictions. In other words, as Derrida insists, the contradiction in the Freudian corpus is not negative, it modulates and conditions the very formation of the concept of the archive and of the concept in general, right where they bear the contradiction.